Welcome to Simplified Summary. If you're joining us today, it means you're insanely curious and you want to get straight to the heart of some truly complex, fascinating material.
Yeah, you're looking for a shortcut to being well-informed, right? Without all that dreaded information overload.
Exactly. Well, you are in exactly the right place. But before we dive in, I want to humbly ask you to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out. And don't forget to like this video and share your valuable comments down below. We love reading your thoughts.
We really do. And we've got a fantastic deep dive planned for you today.
We absolutely do. Our mission today is to explore excerpts from a profoundly impactful collection of stories. We're looking at Munshi Premchand's celebrated Mansarovar Part 2. We're going to extract the absolute core insights from these narratives because these aren't just stories. They serve as this profound, sometimes really uncomfortable mirror-reflecting society, the dark dynamics of power, and, the deepest, most hidden corners of human psychology.
It's so great to be here to explore this with you. To really understand what we're looking at today, we have to provide a little bit of context first. Premchand wasn't just a storyteller. He was essentially a social diagnostician.
Oh, I like that term.
Yeah, he had this uncanny ability to put his finger right on the pulse of the systemic diseases plaguing society. Our thematic roadmap for this deep dive is going to take us to some pretty intense territory. We'll be exploring stories of invisible societal cages, the absolute corruption of power, and ultimately the profound loyalty that can be found in the most unexpected places.
I am so ready for this. I mean, it's a heavy stack of sources we're going through, but the insights are just incredible.
They are. But before we jump in, I do need to make a quick but really important note. Some of the stories we're unpacking today deal heavily with themes of class struggle, labor strikes, and intense colonial-era conflicts. We want to be very clear with you, the listener. We aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoints here, left-wing, right-wing, or otherwise.
Right. Totally impartial.
Exactly. Our goal is strictly impartial. We're simply unpacking the fascinating ideas, the historical context, and the raw narratives exactly as Premchand wrote them, just so you can understand the ideas contained in the original source material.
Absolutely. And with that in mind, let's dive right into the deep end with the corrupting nature of power and what almost feels like, well, karmic cycles.
Yeah, karma plays a huge role here.
It really does. So the first story from our sources is called Damul Kakaidi, or the Prisoner of Damul. We meet this guy, Seth Kubchand. He's a very wealthy mill owner, the kind of guy who measures his entire self-worth by his authority over others.
Right, his identity is completely wrapped up in being the boss.
Exactly. So his laborers decide to go on strike because their wages are being cut, despite the fact that the mill is making massive profits. Things get incredibly tense. Seth Kubchand finds himself surrounded by hundreds of angry workers. And in this moment of sheer panic, driven by utter arrogance and this absolute refusal to lose face, he pulls out a revolver and shoots the young labor leader, a man named Gopi.
It's a visceral, completely chaotic scene. Kubchand's action isn't just self-defense. It's the ultimate expression of oppressive power lashing out when it feels threatened by the very people it exploits.
Right, because he doesn't see them as equals.
He doesn't see Gopi as a human being at all. He sees him as a malfunction in his profit machine.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because Premchand doesn't just leave it there as a simple morality tale. He hits us with a massive time jump.
This is where it gets brilliant.
Yeah. 15 years pass. Kubchand is an old man now, living with the memory of that terrible day. But his own grandson, a young man named Krishnachandra, has grown up with completely different ideals. Krishnachandra actually becomes a labor leader himself.
The irony is just staggering.
It's wild. He ends up leading a strike against a cruel manager at another mill. And during a protest, the unthinkable happens. Krishnachandra is shot. His grandfather, Seth Kubchand, arrives just in time to see his grandson fall to the ground while the workers are chanting his name. It's a devastating, heartbreaking realization for the old man.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Premchand is using this incredibly tragic narrative to illustrate the cyclical nature of violence and exploitation. Oppressive power eventually turns on itself.
It always comes back around.
Exactly. The violence Kubchand released into the world out of greed and fear circled back and claimed the person he loved most. It's a stark warning that you can't build an empire on suffering without that suffering eventually breaching your own walls. You're setting a precedent for how human life is valued, and eventually that devaluation catches up to your own bloodline.
It really makes you think about the long-term consequences of our actions, especially when we think we're insulated by wealth or status. And Premchand shows different reactions to this kind of power imbalance in other stories, too. like in the quick, visceral anecdote from Motor Chinte, which translates to mud splatters from a motor car.
Oh, that one is so raw.
It really is. The narrator is just walking down the road and gets splashed with mud by a wealthy man driving a car. But instead of just taking it and walking away, the narrator physically rebels. He actually beats the sahib with a stick, gathers a huge crowd, and forces the arrogant man to make a public apology.
Now, to really grasp the weight of that, we have to talk about that word, sahib. It isn't just a casual term for a wealthy guy in a car.
No, it carries a lot of baggage.
A massive amount of baggage. In the context of Premchand's era, sahib carries the immense weight of colonial or deep feudal difference. It's a title that demands absolute submission from the lower classes. So when the narrator strikes him, it's not just road rage. It's the release of decades of pent-up class pressure. It shows the absolute boiling point of the oppressed.
Right, it's a completely explosive reaction to class arrogance. But what happens when that oppression isn't just a fleeting moment on the street, but a long-term systemic reality? That brings us to a really haunting fragment titled Kaidi, or The Prisoner. We read about a man named Ivan who is emerging from the Okhotsk jail after 14 years of constant mental and physical torture.
And for anyone wondering why a cornerstone of Indian literature is writing about a Russian prison in Okhotsk, it helps to remember that Premchand was a voracious reader and translator of global literature, particularly Russian authors like Tolstoy. He's using this specific setting as a universal symbol for the ultimate carceral state.
That makes so much sense because Premchand writes that Ivan doesn't come out as a broken, wingless bird, which is exactly what the system intends to create. Instead, he emerges like a fierce, bloodthirsty lion. Premchand describes this liquid flame of desire burning inside him.
Which is a terrifying, brilliant psychological insight. Premchand is pushing the analysis far beyond the simple idea that prisons are bad. He's showing us how systemic deprivation forces individuals to shed their societal conditioning just to survive.
It strips them down to the studs.
Exactly. The system tries to crush Ivan into obedience, but instead it strips away his humanity and leaves only a primal, predatory instinct. The so-called rehabilitation system is actually a factory for creating the very monsters society claims to fear.
We've been talking so much about physical cages, prisons and public workplace exploitation. But what's really terrifying about Premchand's work is how he shows that exact same oppressive power dynamic operating behind closed doors. Some of the most brutal cages in these sources are completely invisible, forged by gender and societal norms right inside a marriage.
This is where Premchand shifts from the public sphere to the intimately private sphere of the home, diagnosing a deeply ingrained cultural disease.
That brings us to the story, Kusum. We get to read these heartbreaking letters written by a young, highly educated woman named Kusum, addressed entirely to her indifferent husband. They've been married for a year, but he refuses to speak to her or acknowledge her existence.
It's a complete stonewall.
Total stonewall. She's writing these letters on pink, scented paper, begging him for a response. She literally begs for forgiveness for mistakes she doesn't even know she committed. At one point, she's so desperate she offers to drink poison if it would just please him and bring him peace.
It's excruciating to read. Kusum is clearly intelligent. He's a talented writer. She manages the household flawlessly, yet she's reduced to pleading for basic human decency. Think about the psychological toll of writing to a brick wall. Premchand is highlighting that the husband's complete silence, his absolute refusal to communicate, is actually a calculated weapon.
It's an active choice he's making.
Exactly. It's a form of psychological control that's arguably more cruel than physical violence, because it denies her very existence and drives her to question her own sanity.
And here's the detail that really stuck with me. In one of the letters, Kusum shares a profound realization. She had read in a book that in ancient times, men would physically and violently capture women, treating them as property to be guarded. She looks at her own life and realizes that her modern marriage, in her society, is functionally no different.
What's fascinating here is how Premchand dissects that illusion of progress. The invisible chains of tradition have simply replaced the physical shackles of the past. He's critiquing a system where a woman, regardless of her education or capability, is entirely stripped of her agency. The institution itself, in that historical context, is built on a foundation of captivity.
But hold on. If tradition is the cage, what about breaking those traditions? Because Premchand explores that too in the story, Miss Padma. Here we have a couple, Prasad and his partner, who consider themselves highly progressive. They make a pact to live together freely without the traditional legal bonds of marriage. On paper, it sounds liberating.
On paper, yes. But Premchand is incredibly cynical about human nature when power is left unchecked. He exposes a very dark undercurrent to this progressive arrangement.
During a dialogue, Prasad casually admits a terrifying logic to her. He says that because they're living outside of societal norms, he doesn't have the legal or social power that a traditional husband would use to control her. Therefore, he tells her, if she ever breaks their pact, his only recourse would be brute force and murder.
This raises a critical question for the reader. Has anything really changed? Prasad hasn't evolved past the patriarchal need for control. He's just found a modern loophole to maintain it without any of the traditional responsibilities. Premchand is showing us that whether the relationship is dressed up in conservative customs or modern so-called progressive ideas, the fundamental power imbalance remains. The threat of violence is always hovering just beneath the surface, keeping the invisible cage locked.
So how do people actually survive in these systems when the deck is so thoroughly stacked against them? Here's where it gets really interesting, because Premchand takes us into the trap of indentured servitude in the story Shudra.
This story provides a harrowing look at how vulnerable populations are manipulated by colonial and capitalistic forces, and how survival often comes down to sheer moral endurance.
We follow Gara and Mangaru, a couple lured away from their village to Calcutta with the promise of good work and a better life. But when they arrive, they realize they've been tricked into a system that's basically legalized slavery. They're completely trapped. The climax of the resistance is one of the most intense, visceral scenes in the entire source text. A British agent decides he wants Gara for himself and demands her. Mangaru is older, he's lost his youthful strength, but he fiercely defends his wife. The agent starts brutally beating Mangaru with a hunter whip.
It's a moment of absolute terrifying desperation. The physical reality of the colonial machine literally coming down on the back of an impoverished laborer.
And Gara, seeing the man she loves being beaten to death, throws herself over Mangaru. She uses her own body as a human shield, taking the blows, begging the agent to beat her instead of him.
If we look closely at this scene, it's a masterful intersection of so many massive themes. You've got the unchecked brutality of colonial power, you have the extreme vulnerability of the lower classes, but shining through all of that dirt and blood is the incredible resilience of human love.
It's so powerful.
Mangaru and Gara have absolutely nothing left in the world. No money, no status, no freedom, but they have their fierce loyalty to each other. And in Premchand's universe, that unwavering empathy makes them morally superior to the man holding the whip. They refuse to be corrupted by the cruelty around them.
They're completely unbroken on the inside. But Premchand doesn't always give us such pure, enduring love. He also shows us how easily that humanity can be corrupted by the tragedy of greed, like in the stories Nur and Unmad. In Nur, we meet a very simple, loving laborer who is perfectly happy with his life until a fake sadhu tricks him.
Now, to understand how devastating this is, we have to remember what a sadhu represents. A sadhu is supposed to be a revered, holy ascetic, someone who has entirely renounced worldly possessions. So for a con man, to use that ultimate spiritual trust to steal jewelry.
It's the ultimate betrayal.
Exactly. It isn't just a financial theft. It's a profound spiritual violation that shatters Nur's worldview entirely.
Right. The fake sadhu convinces Nur to hand over his wife's jewelry, promising to magically turn it into gold. Of course, he just steals it. Nur is so consumed by shame and the sudden greed that poisoned his own mind that he flees his village. He ironically becomes a fake sadhu himself, eventually finds real treasure, but when he finally returns home, he finds his beloved wife has died of grief and poverty. It's a completely self-inflicted wound.
Nur had everything he actually needed, but the illusion of wealth destroyed his reality. He traded his actual life for a mirage.
We see a much more modern version of that in Unmad. Manhar is a man who abandons his incredibly devoted wife, Vageshwari, because he goes abroad and finds massive success. He gets together with a new partner, Jenny, but his unexamined ambition eventually causes him to completely lose his mind.
Think about Manhar's transformation. Premchand is essentially dissecting the hustle culture of his era. Manhar doesn't just lose his wife, he loses his identity because his entire sense of self became tied to transactional success and social climbing. When that fragile foundation cracks, there's no core self left to fall back on.
He returns to his home village years later, completely in rags, barely remembering who he is. Vageshwari, despite everything he put her through, tries to protect him. In the tragic climax, Jenny tracks him down and tries to shoot Vageshwari in a fit of rage. Manhar, in a final moment of clarity, jumps in front of the bullet, sacrificing himself to save his first wife.
These two stories serve as a really powerful tandem. Premchand is explicitly showing us that greed, unexamined ambition, and the constant gnawing desire for more are corrosive. They destroy the simplest, most beautiful human connections. Once you let that purely transactional mindset into your heart, it eats away at your capacity for genuine love.
It's incredibly bleak, but to contrast all this human cruelty, betrayal, and greed, I want to brightly pivot to what might be the most famous tale in our sources, and honestly, a much-needed breath of fresh air. We are talking about Bailon ki Katha, or The Tale of Two
Ah
Oxen.
yes, this is a brilliant, totally unexpected shift in perspective from Premchand.
It's almost like the ultimate buddy cop movie, but with farm animals. The heroes of the story aren't humans. They're two oxen named Hira and Moti. Premchand details their incredibly deep bond. They communicate silently, they lick each other to show affection and comfort one another after a long day of plowing. But they're sold and mistreated by a new, cruel owner named Gaia, who feeds them nothing but dry fodder and beats them. They manage to escape and go on this grand adventure. At one point, they use incredible teamwork to fight off a massive, aggressive wild bull. They're literally watching each other's backs in a life-or-death brawl.
Their synergy, their absolute trust in one another, is something the human characters in Premchand's stories rarely, if ever, achieve.
But the emotional peak of their story happens when they're caught and thrown into the kanji house, which is a cattle pound. It's basically a prison for stray animals, and the creatures inside are starving to death, just skeletal. Hira is tied up with a thick rope. Moti, using his horns, actually manages to break down the mud wall of the pound. He frees all the other starving horses, goats, and buffaloes. They all run to freedom. But Moti refuses to escape. He walks back over and lies down next to Hira because his best friend is still tied up and can't leave.
What's fascinating here is the contrast Premchand is drawing. It is just devastating. Throughout all the sources we've discussed today, we've seen humans betraying each other, exploiting each other, shooting each other, and abandoning their families for wealth or power. But here, Premchand brilliantly assigns the highest moral virtues, absolute loyalty, deep empathy, and collective rebellion against tyranny, to animals. Hira and Moti represent the absolute ideal of brotherhood. Their story serves as a profound, almost stinging critique of the humans in all the other stories. The beasts are humane, while the humans behave like beasts.
It completely flips the script on what it means to be civilized. So, looking back at everything we've covered today, this deep dive into Premchand's sources reveals something so incredibly timeless. Whether it's the silent psychological suffering in a marriage like Kusum's, the violent generational clash in a factory like Seth Kupchand's, or the profound loyalty found in a dusty cattle pound, we're constantly witnessing the struggle between the oppressed and the oppressors.
And that struggle is far from over. If we bring these themes into the modern day, the text asks us to hold up a mirror to our own lives. We have to reflect on how empathy, or the lack of it, and subtle power dynamics still govern our daily interactions, our modern workplaces, and our relationships. Are we using our silence as a weapon, like Kusum's husband? Are we letting transactional ambition blind us to the value of the people who actually support us, like Monarch? Premchand's diagnosis of society is unfortunately still highly relevant because human nature hasn't fundamentally changed.
It brings me to a final, lingering question for you to mull over as you go about your day. In all these stories, we've looked at physical cages, like colonial prisons, societal cages like indentured servitude, and psychological cages within marriages. But consider this. What if the most dangerous cages aren't the ones imposed on us by society, or a cruel boss, or an indifferent spouse? What if the most unbreakable cages are the ones we unknowingly build for ourselves out of our own complacency, our greed, and our unexamined biases? If Munshi Premchand were to write the story of your life today, would you be the one building the walls, or the one breaking them down?
That is certainly a thought to sit with. Thank you so much for exploring this incredible material with us.
Yes, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And remember to subscribe to Simplified Summary for more videos like this. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and farewell.